Hello everyone, I'm True Scares. I'll read a story that maybe one of you has experienced, and I am here to help you today. I know you're using this video to help you sleep. So before we begin, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're from and what time you're watching. Lay back comfortably, relax, and let's begin. Story by Lucas Harper. The night was cold, and the highway stretched endlessly into the darkness. I was driving alone, heading home after a long day of work. My job as a network technician often took me to small, isolated towns barely visible on the map. That day had been no different, and thanks to some unexpected delays, it was well past midnight by the time I was on the road. The streetlights had become sparse, their faint glow swallowed by the surrounding trees. Darkness enveloped the road, broken only by the beam of my headlights cutting through the dense night. The only sound was the hum of the tires against the asphalt, accompanied by the occasional rush of wind against the car. To keep my mind distracted from exhaustion, I turned on the radio, but the signal faltered, fading into static. Frustrated, I switched it off, allowing the silence to take over. And that's when I saw her. A woman stood on the shoulder of the road, her hand raised in a classic hitchhiking gesture. She was wearing a long coat, her hair flowing loosely over her shoulders. Her face appeared pale under the glare of my headlights, almost ghostly. I eased my foot off the accelerator, slowing the car as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. There was nothing behind her, only the tall, blackened silhouettes of trees standing like silent sentinels. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 12:37 a.m. What's she doing out here at this hour? I thought to myself. Logic told me to keep driving, but something deeper, a sense of pity perhaps, made me reconsider. The night was freezing, and leaving her out there seemed cruel. I rolled down the window just enough for my voice to carry. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound as casual as I could, though unease had already settled in my chest. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she gave a small, slow nod, her eyes locking onto mine with a look I couldn't quite place. Was it desperation or something else? Against my better judgment, I reached over and unlocked the passenger door. The woman slid into the passenger seat without a word. She moved gracefully, almost too smoothly, as though her steps barely touched the ground. Once inside, she pulled the door shut gently, and the soft click seemed unnaturally loud in the silent car. I glanced at her as she settled in. Her coat, though long and heavy, seemed weathered and old-fashioned, the kind of garment you'd expect to see in a vintage photograph, rather than on someone standing by a modern highway. Her hair, dark and slightly unkempt, framed her face, but it was her eyes that stood out. Large, dark, and so deep they seemed to draw the light out of the car's interior. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice attempting to break the thick quiet between us. "Just down the road," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was flat, devoid of any warmth or emotion, yet oddly captivating. "Okay," I said, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. "It's not safe out here at this hour." She didn't respond, simply nodding again as she stared out the windshield. Her lack of conversation unsettled me. Most hitchhikers, I assumed, would at least offer some explanation or small talk. But she sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if the world outside was of no concern to her. I glanced at her coat. The fabric was damp, and for a brief moment I thought I smelled rainwater mixed with something metallic. Blood? I dismissed the thought quickly, chalking it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. "So, what brings you out here?" I tried again, hoping to pull her into conversation. She turned her head slightly toward me, her expression blank, but her eyes piercing. "I needed to get away," she said, her tone still emotionless. "From what?" I asked instinctively before realizing I probably didn't want to know the answer. She didn't reply this time. Instead, her gaze drifted back to the windshield, and I felt a shiver run down my spine despite the heater blowing warm air. I focused on the road, trying to shake the growing sense of dread creeping into my mind. The silence between us became oppressive, the kind that made every small sound, the hum of the tires, the faint rattle of loose change in the cup holder, feel magnified. I turned on the radio again, hoping for some music to ease the tension, but the static returned. Frustrated, I turned it off. "Sorry about the radio," I said awkwardly. "This stretch of road doesn't get great reception." "It's fine," she said, though her voice seemed to echo faintly, as if the words lingered longer than they should. I tightened my grip on the wheel, glancing at her from the corner of my eye. Her pale complexion seemed even more washed out under the dim light from the dashboard. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I pressed on, deciding to focus on the road ahead. Trees lined both sides, their branches clawing at the sky. The occasional streetlight appeared like a ghostly beacon, illuminating stretches of asphalt before plunging us back into darkness. That's when I noticed it. Her reflection in the passenger side window didn't match her movements. While she sat motionless, staring ahead, the faint image in the glass seemed to twitch slightly, as if shifting in place. My breath caught, and I immediately looked away, heart pounding in my chest. It had to be a trick of the light, right? The car sped down the desolate highway, the headlights illuminating patches of cracked asphalt and the skeletal outlines of trees. I tried to focus on driving, forcing myself to ignore the gnawing discomfort growing in my chest. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She hadn't moved since the moment she sat down. Her hands were still folded neatly in her lap, her posture rigid. Occasionally, I'd steal a glance at her, hoping to catch some sign of normalcy. A nervous twitch, a fidget, anything. But she remained eerily still, her face expressionless, her eyes locked straight ahead. "Are you from around here?" I asked, breaking the silence that had become unbearable. "No," she replied softly, the single word hanging in the air like a distant echo. I waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. Frustration mixed with unease, and I gripped the wheel tighter. The air in the car felt heavy, oppressive, as if the space between us had grown smaller. I glanced at her again, noticing how the dim light from the dashboard seemed to cast shadows across her face in a way that didn't make sense. "I don't mean to pry," I said cautiously, "but it's dangerous to be out here alone at night. Were you stranded, or—" Her head turned sharply toward me, her eyes locking onto mine. For the first time, I saw something behind her gaze, a flicker of anger, or perhaps fear. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, her voice firmer this time, almost cutting. "Okay," I said quickly, swallowing hard. "No problem." I returned my focus to the road, my mind racing. The way she'd looked at me sent a chill down my spine, and her words carried a finality that made it clear I shouldn't ask again. But as the silence stretched on, my curiosity grew unbearable. Who was she, and what was she running from? The sound of a soft thump pulled me from my thoughts. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see a pothole or debris on the road. But there was nothing. The darkness behind the car was absolute, an impenetrable void that seemed to stretch endlessly. Another thump, this time louder. "What was that?" I muttered, half to myself. She didn't answer, didn't even flinch. It was as if she hadn't heard it, or worse, as if she didn't care. My stomach twisted, and I pressed my foot lightly on the brake, slowing the car just enough to listen more closely. The thumping stopped. For a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then a faint scratching sound came from the roof, like nails dragging across the metal. I froze, my hands tightening around the wheel as my heart began to race. Do you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. She turned her head toward me again, her expression calm, almost serene. It's nothing, she said flatly. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was crawling across the roof of the car. I glanced at her, desperate for any reaction, but she remained unnervingly calm, her eyes fixed on me as if daring me to question her. I slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt and the sound stopped. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. "Stay here," I said, my voice trembling as I reached for the door handle. "You shouldn't get out," she said softly. I paused, her words sending a fresh wave of dread coursing through me. "Why not?" I asked, my hand hovering over the handle. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back toward the windshield, her gaze distant. "It won't matter," she murmured almost to herself. Ignoring her, I pushed the door open and stepped out. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I shivered as I scanned the area around the car. The road was empty, the trees casting long, twisted shadows under the moonlight. My breath fogged in front of me as I walked to the front of the car, my eyes darting between the roof and the ground. Nothing. No scratches, no dents, no sign that anything had been on the car. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe I was just tired, imagining things that weren't there. But as I turned to get back into the car, I froze. She was watching me. Through the windshield, her dark eyes bore into mine, unblinking. Her face was illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move behind her. A shadow, too large and too distorted to belong to either of us, shifted briefly before disappearing. I climbed back into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. "There's nothing out there," I said, more to reassure myself than her. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned her head slowly toward me, a faint smile curling her lips. "Are you sure about that?" she asked. I pressed the accelerator harder than I should have, and the car jolted forward, the tires skidding slightly on the cold asphalt. The woman beside me didn't react. Her faint, knowing smile lingered, as if she found my fear amusing. The silence between us felt heavier now, oppressive. My mind raced as I tried to piece everything together, her odd behavior, the strange noises, the shadow I thought I'd seen. It didn't make sense. None of it did. And yet, deep down, I knew something was wrong. Horribly wrong. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the road, her hands still folded neatly in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm. "I told you I just needed to get away." "That's not what I mean," I said, my grip tightening on the wheel. "Who are you really? Why were you out there in the middle of nowhere?" Her smile faded, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she regarded me. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked. "What?" The question caught me off guard. "What does that have to do with anything?" She ignored me, her gaze growing distant. "Sometimes fate puts us where we need to be. Sometimes it makes sure we meet the people we're supposed to meet." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice unsteady. She turned to face me fully now, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "You were meant to pick me up," she said softly, her tone carrying a strange weight. "You were meant to take me where I need to go." "And where's that?" I asked, my stomach twisting into knots. Her lips parted as if she was about to answer, but before she could, the car shuddered violently, as if something had struck it from below. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat as the car skidded to a stop. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, looking frantically around. She didn't reply. Instead, she reached for the door handle and pushed it open. "Wait!" I shouted, but she was already stepping out of the car. The freezing air rushed in as I followed her, the chill biting at my skin. She stood a few feet from the car, her figure barely visible under the pale moonlight. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my breath clouding in front of me. She turned to face me, her expression calm, almost serene. "We're here," she said. "Here? What are you talking about?" I looked around, my eyes scanning the empty stretch of road. There was nothing, no buildings, no signs, not even a landmark to indicate where we were. Just the endless black ribbon of asphalt cutting through the trees. "You'll see," she said cryptically, her voice barely above a whisper. A low, guttural sound echoed from the darkness, cutting through the stillness like a knife. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. It sounded wrong, like something alive, but not entirely human. "What is that?" I asked, my voice trembling as I backed toward the car. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer to the edge of the road, her eyes fixed on the darkness. The sound grew louder, closer, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "We need to go," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "Get back in the car." But she didn't move. Instead, she turned to me, her expression unreadable. "This is where we part ways," she said. "What are you talking about? Get in the car." I reached for her arm, but before I could, the sound erupted into a deafening roar, and the shadows at the edge of the forest seemed to come alive. My instincts took over, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands fumbling with the key as I tried to start the engine. The woman stood motionless in the headlights, her figure silhouetted against the now writhing shadows. Her head turned slightly, and for a brief moment I thought I saw her smile again. The engine roared to life, and without thinking, I floored the accelerator. The car lurched forward, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of her standing there, the shadows closing in around her until she vanished completely. I drove faster than I ever had before, the road blurring under the glare of the headlights. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded in my chest as adrenaline coursed through me, drowning out the echoes of whatever had just happened. She was gone, but her words lingered. "This is where we part ways." The way she'd said it, so calm, so final, sent chills through me. I tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing by leaving her behind, that she wasn't my responsibility. But deep down, I knew I wasn't fleeing from her. I was fleeing from something else. The road ahead stretched into darkness, endless and empty. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat, but it was empty. My breath caught as I noticed something on the passenger seat. A small, delicate object glinted faintly under the dim interior light. It was a bracelet, silver with a charm shaped like a tiny heart. I didn't remember seeing her wearing it, but it was undeniably hers. How did it get there? I didn't stop to think about it. My mind raced with the possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Had she left it intentionally, or had something else placed it there? I kept driving, my pulse quickening with every passing mile. The car's engine hummed steadily, a sound that should have been comforting but now felt ominous. The road seemed different somehow, longer, darker, as if it were stretching on forever. The further I drove, the more the air around me changed. It felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the weight of unseen eyes watching my every move. I tried to shake the feeling, focusing on the road ahead, but the silence pressed down on me. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop mere feet away from the figure. My heart pounded as I stared, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. It was her. The same coat, the same pale face, the same dark eyes. She stood motionless, her gaze fixed on me through the windshield. "No," I whispered, shaking my head in disbelief. "This isn't possible." I blinked, hoping she'd vanish, that it was just my imagination. But she didn't move. She stood there, solid and real, her expression calm and unreadable. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay in the car, I opened the door and stepped out. The cold night air hit me like a wall, but I barely noticed. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied me. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice as soft and emotionless as before. "Understand what?" I asked, frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. "Why are you doing this?" She took a step closer and I instinctively backed away. "I needed someone to help me," she said, her tone unwavering. "And you did." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I don't even know you." Her lips curled into a faint smile, one that sent a shiver down my spine. "You'll remember soon enough," she said. Before I could respond, the world around me seemed to shift. The trees blurred, the road dissolved, and the air grew colder. A piercing sound filled my ears, a mix of wind and whispers, words I couldn't understand. And then, everything went black. I woke up slumped over the steering wheel, the faint glow of dawn breaking through the windshield. My head throbbed and my body ached as if I'd been in a fight. I sat up slowly, trying to piece together what had happened. The road was empty. The woman was gone. For a moment, I thought it might have been a nightmare, a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then I saw the bracelet, still lying on the passenger seat, a stark reminder that it wasn't over. As I picked it up, a cold dread washed over me. Inscribed on the back of the charm were 2 words: "Thank you." I dropped the bracelet, my hands trembling. Questions swirled in my mind, but there were no answers. Only one thing was certain. Whatever had happened that night wasn't natural, and it wasn't something I would ever forget. I started the car and drove away, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The sun rose higher, but the chill in the air remained, a constant reminder of the passenger I'd picked up in the dead of night.